Because unless you understand where he's going and what is his motivation, what Paul says in our text today can be really hard to follow, even more difficult than he is in other places to follow. So I'm going to walk you through it today, as actually do the reading in parts as we read through it. And I'm going to give some commentary on the sections. This is more formally called giving you an exegetical perspective. Now, isn't that a nice word? Exegetical perspective. I'd rather call it giving you a fighting chance at understanding what's being said in the text. It's kind of study that can be done with your study Bible or commentaries that can help us as we move through, and when you might be doing this on your own. So let's start. Paul has a problem. He's no longer in Corinth, and a group that he will call, ironically, super apostles is attempting to take over. This group seems to consist of rival missionaries with exceptionally elegant speech. Key to what they are doing is that they are boasting about revelations and visions they have received. And they have entered into some sort of monetary relationship with the Corinthians, favorable to themselves, something Paul strictly avoided, likely not wanting to set up a patron-client dynamic between himself and the Corinthians. This is not the dynamic Paul was seeking for the early church. Our reading today falls at the end of what is called Paul's fool's speech. It is his response to these super apostles in Corinth. It takes up the whole of chapter 11 of 2 Corinthians and finishes up with our reading for today. In this speech, he is trying to convince the Corinthians that his ministry is quantitatively and qualitatively different, better, and therefore superior to these, quote, super apostles. In the first part of the speech, it's the first part of chapter 11, Paul argues that he is in no way inferior to this group, and even then accuses them of deceit and being only disguised as apostles of Christ. Paul uses very strong words and is very direct. In the second part of the speech, which is the second part of chapter 11, just ahead of our reading today, is a summary of Paul's impressive ministry and hardships he has faced. The beatings, the shipwrecks, the harsh treatment he has received from both Gentiles and Jews. Paul has a very impressive CV for sure. Then comes our reading today. In the very first verse, Paul seems to set up the expectation that he is going to boast about his visions and revelations. Boast, since the super apostles apparently did this on a regular basis to impress their audience. It's kind of like Paul saying, well, if that's what you want, I can do that too. But if nothing else, Paul is clever, very clever. Paul goes on to boast in a very different way, one that is actually indirect. Rather than referring to himself as the super apostles would, Paul talks about someone he claims to know. I know a guy. That's the phrasing he's going to essentially use. Readers like us are left to infer that it really means Paul himself. He thereby cleverly avoids doing the same self-promoting he has just accused the others of doing. But he goes further. The personal claims to have been caught up, these apostles claim to have been caught up in the third heaven, meaning paradise. There, they hear and experience things that no mortal is to repeat. That's Paul's part of the message. Honoring this instruction that no mortal is to repeat what they hear in the third heaven, Paul is justified in not going into that any further. It's enough that he has been there. He can say that he too has had visions and experienced revelations worthy of any of the apostles. And saying it this way does not violate instructions and is within boasting as the super apostles did. Kind of a clever trick. Now, with that background, that exegesis, either in your bulletin or in the Pew Bible, page 226, the New Testament, let's read the first 5 verses. So 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 1 through 5. And this first phrase comes out almost like a question. It is necessary to boast. Nothing is gained by it, but I will go on to visions and revelations. I know a person in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up in the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that such a person, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows, was caught up into the paradise and heard things that are not to be told, that no mortal is permitted to repeat. On behalf of such a one, I will boast, but on my own behalf, I will not boast, except of my weakness. I hope you'll agree with me, that's fairly clever writing there. I know about this too. I experienced it, says Paul, and I know you are not permitted to repeat what you heard. Verse 6 and the first part of verse 7 give us kind of the punchline. I'm going to add a few phrases just to give emphasis here. If I did want to brag, just saying, if I did want to brag, I wouldn't make a fool of myself, parenthetically, like those super apostles you are hearing, because I tell the truth. You might ask why? I'm holding back from bragging so that no one will give me any more credit than what anyone else sees or hears about me, even considering the exceptional character of the revelations. Paul wants to show the power and the authority of his and his co-workers' ministry. At the same time, he wants to show how this is both different and superior to these rival missionaries. Then in comes that term weakness. Although this argument has been indirectly trying to establish that the seemingly weakness of Paul and his co-workers alleged by his rivals actually gives them or represents their power. I'm sure you could sense as we read this, those constrained words that Paul, who had years earlier been blessed with a vision of heavenly realm, was really tempted to go toe to toe with those super apostles. But Paul knew, as the saying goes, don't wrestle with a pig. You both get dirty, and the pig liked it. Said in a more refined fashion, Paul knew that a shouting match would only lead to his audience to accept the opponent's argument. Accepting their claims that inward spiritual experiences visiting heaven were a valid basis for having religious authority. As John McFadden summarizes it, just as Paul had earlier affirmed that he regularly spoke in tongues, but refrained from doing it in public because it did not benefit the entire community. Now Paul alludes to his powerful vision without directly describing it. Such inward experiences deepen his faith, but they do not constitute a basis for his authority over the church. That authority rests not upon what he has experienced in an inward, private way, but on the manner in which he is living the gospel in their midst. as he told them before, look at what is before your eyes. Authority of his ministry is based on the manner in which he is living the gospel in their midst. Paul models spreading the gospel for us. Let others see, let others look and see the gospel in your life, Paul says. As a saying attributed to St. Francis of Assisi goes, preach the gospel at all times. Use words if necessary. Let's move on. In the second portion of our reading, at verse 7, we will come to the famous thorn in the flesh that Paul has. Let's read the remainder of the text, starting with the second half of verse 7. Therefore, to keep me from being too elated, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from being too elated. 3 times I appealed to the Lord about this, that it would leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. So I will boast all the more gladly of my weakness, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore I am content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities for the sake of Christ. For whenever I am weak, then I am strong. Ironically, although many have speculated many different things, truth is that no one knows what Paul's thorn might have been. Paul does not say. Likely in his letter, Paul did not need to say. His audience would have known what the thorn was. They would have known how the super apostles were using whatever it was against him. Paul has even asked the Lord to remove it 3 times, but it remains. Leaving this thorn unnamed actually has a benefit. Leaving the thorn unnamed allows us to relate, to fill in with our own thorns, our own imperfections, as we relate our own experience and ministries to this passage of Paul's ministry. Paul's understanding of the thorn is that it is an agent of Satan sent to diminish him and his mission. But he also knows the strategy of Satan backfired. Backfired because it guards him against being carried away from some esoteric heavenly visions. Without the thorn, Paul could have fallen easily into the same trap as those super apostles. His mission could have been diverted to giving glowing descriptions of his experiences and building his self-importance among the Corinthians, and perhaps even building his own wealth. That which Satan sent to do harm has been transformed by God's grace to a good gift. Where do we go with Paul's thorn message? First, acknowledge, as Paul did, that thorns are not sent by God as some sort of punishment. Having thorns is part of the human condition. We all have our thorns, things that burden us, things that constrain us. We also know that we have a God who shares our burdens. Yet, like Paul, we can discover God's grace even in our weakness and limitations. I repeat, Paul clearly understands his thorn as an agent of Satan, not God. God did not cause his affliction any more than God causes a child to develop leukemia. Paul wants us to know that God is present even in the difficult things God does not cause. Paul wants us to know the grace of God can be made obvious, made apparent, even through the afflictions brought upon us. And God grieves and sorrows with us. For Paul, God's grace is a given, not something earned, not something deserved. This grace is God's gift that allows Paul and us to prevail over sin, to prevail over weakness and hardship. God has told us directly, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. Well, now that you can think about Paul's message to the Corinthians about those super apostles, Paul's fool's speech, Paul clearly does not boast of his transcendent heavenly experience, but rather his human weakness, his thorn. The thorn remains as Paul's constant reminder that he is not God, that he has weakness, that he is dependent on the power of Christ. But Paul has a message for the Corinthians and for us, much beyond just don't listen to those crazy guys. He tells us, as is true in so many dimensions of faith, there's a paradox here. That paradox is that we can go ahead and express humility before God for our weaknesses. We can express humility because we know the love, power, and glory of God are made visible through the good we are able to accomplish in spite of those weaknesses. As St. Francis said, preach the gospel at all times. Use words when necessary. Our thorns should inform us in ways that make our public ministries more faithful. Rather than, unlike the super apostles, our personal encounter with the risen Christ need not be described by transcendent experiences of personal glory. Rather, our calling is to be the presence of Christ to others. We can and should speak humbly and honestly of our weaknesses and limitations, bragging not of our own accomplishments, but what God is able to accomplish through our lives, despite our weaknesses. For as Paul would have us remember, whenever I am weak, I am strong. Amen.